So growing up, one of my favorite movies was The Prince of Egypt. If you guys haven't seen it, man, I highly encourage you guys to watch it. I loved it. It's not fully accurate, but it's so good. Ben, one of my favorite scenes was there's a scene where the 10 plagues are all happening at once, which um, I don't know if it necessarily happened all at once, but it's so cool from a visual standpoint to see it all, as well as the song that goes on during that scene is just so powerful and kind of so cool. So before we continue, I'm going to try to link it to this video. So I encourage you guys to watch that right now before I continue, so you guys know what I'm talking about. So as we continue, this today I want to look at just the 10 plagues. So Sunday mornings we were supposed to be doing our city series over basic stories of the Bible, and we looked at creation, we looked at the story of Joseph, and today would be the 10 plagues. So I want to dive into this a little bit, just have a little bit of time with you as we study and look at this. But as we look at this situation here in Egypt, what we happened is that these people have come into Egypt, that they were part of Joseph. They came in, and Joseph passed away, and then the people that knew Joseph, the situation it passed. It was 400 years, and we come to the situation where now the Hebrews, or God's people, are slaves and servants in Egypt. No longer are they special and important because of Joseph, but now they're just doing orders, following whatever the Egyptians want. So at this point, Moses has come into the picture. Moses was raised in Pharaoh's household, leaves because he kills an Egyptian, and they want to try him, and he runs and takes off, and he is now safe somewhere else. At this point, that he sees this burning bush, and God tells him to go back to Egypt, to tell Pharaoh, "Let my people go." And he's speaking for God towards Pharaoh. Right? But the difficult situation about this point is that as Pharaoh talks to Moses and hears the God that tells him to listen to what he's saying, to let his people go, Pharaoh doesn't fully understand. Because back then, whenever people got into fights, especially as nations, it was not people versus people, but it was more so God versus God. So, because these Hebrews were servants and slaves to the Egyptians, the Hebrews' God was not as strong or was maybe dead. So, the Egyptians did not recognize their God. Even though the Egyptians were polytheistic, that means they believed in many, many gods, which we'll actually be looking at some today. They didn't believe that the Hebrew God was someone they should be listening to. And in Exodus 4, in Exodus chapter 7, verses 4 and 5, we read the importance of what the plagues were. And it says, "Pharaoh will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring my host, my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment. The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring out the people of Israel from among them." That God was showing his power to the Egyptians, but I think also was he showing his power to his own people, to the Hebrews, because the Hebrews have somehow forgotten who God was and have maybe started worshiping the Egyptian gods. God is coming and saying, "I am the true God." So as we get started, let's look at the first plague. Actually, before we look at the first plague, let's go back a little bit before that, and we can see in chapter 7 that Pharaoh is talking to Moses and Aaron. They go and say, "Our God wants you to let his people go." And Pharaoh says, "What God?" And in verse 8 to verse 13, we see, "Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, when Pharaoh says to you, 'Prove yourselves by working a miracle,' then you shall say to Aaron, 'Take your staff and cast it out before Pharaoh, that it may become a serpent.'" So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did just the Lord commanded. Aaron cast down his staff before Pharaoh and his servants, and it became a serpent. Then Pharaoh summoned the wise men and the sorcerers, and they, the magicians of Egypt, also did the same by their secret arts. For each man cast down his staff, and they became serpents. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. Still Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. So This was the kind of the first sign. It wasn't the first plague, but it was the first sign they did to show God's power. And Pharaoh says, my people can do that too. But what was really impressive was that Aaron's staff ate the staffs of Pharaoh's magicians. So we can already see this battle between these powers that they have. God, Yahweh, that we worship on one side, and the God of the Egyptians on this side. And God says, I am more powerful. So then we can look at the first plague, which we pick up in verse 14 of chapter 7. And this is the water being turned to blood. And this is from 14 to 25. And I won't read that, but I encourage you guys to be reading that. That you guys are maybe have a little bit more free time based on all this stuff. So be reading that. But this section is about the Nile, the water being turned to blood. And Pharaoh, once again copies this. That is, Moses and Aaron do this miracle, this plague. The water in the entire Nile River turns to blood. And then Pharaoh shows his magicians can do that as well. But they do not undo what God did. So the Nile was actually so integral to Egyptian culture. This was kind of their lifeblood to the reason that Egypt was so successful. It created great trading routes. It fertilized and watered their ground. The Nile was huge. And the Nile was actually, there's a god called Happy. And Happy was the god essentially over the Nile. And this god, Happy, went against the God Yahweh, and God said, I am stronger. And Happy was defeated by God. Then we can look at the next plague, which we pick up in Exodus chapter 8, verses 1 through 15. This is the plague of the frogs. And once again, this is God that is going to be showing his power over these Egyptian gods over and over again. Because these frogs came up and they invaded Egypt. And frogs are important. They were part of kind of the Egyptian culture, that it was against Egyptian law to kill frogs. So the magicians once again tried to copy God and just prove his power, but they were not strong enough to remove the frogs. They just added more frogs to it and made a bigger mess. So the god that was over frogs is a god called Hectic, Heqt. And these names, I may be mispronouncing them, and I apologize. They may be spelled differently depending on where you look. But this god, Hectic, was actually had the head of a frog, and this was the god that Yahweh attacked at this point. That when he's showing his power, saying, I am stronger than the Egyptian gods, and I will get my people out. So God defeats the god of Hek, the god of the frogs. And then we can go to the third plague, which is Exodus 8, 16 through 19. And this was the god of lice, of gnats, however you kind of want to describe that, what your translation uses. And at this point, God is starting to get into rhythm and showing the Egyptians and the Hebrews that he is God. And the God that is closely related to, the Egyptian God that's most closely related to lice, gnats, is a God called Geb, G-E-B. And this God was controlling this. And the magicians are wanting to once again try to copy this so that they can say we're still on equal playing field, but they can't. And I'll actually read a little part of this one. And in verse 18 of chapter 8, it says, the magicians tried by their secret arts to produce gnats, but they could not. So there were gnats on man and beast. Then the magician said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. But Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them, as Pharaoh had said. So Pharaoh ignores these guys that are saying, this is God. This guy is more powerful than what we are able to do right now. But Pharaoh doesn't listen, and God defeated Geb. So the next plague is the plague of flies. And this Egyptian god is Kep, Khepri, Khepri. And this plague is the start of where God starts to separate his people from the Egyptians. The first three plagues impacted everything. Now it's starting to separate, which we'll see as these plagues go on. It goes further and further, hitting the Egyptians, ultimately to the 10th plague just hitting the Egyptians that were against God. So this god Khepri is a god over flies. And once again, God defeats Khepri. God keeps knocking down these Egyptian gods one by one. And as he starts to pick up, we can look at the next plague, which is the fifth one, which is the livestock, the death of the Egyptian livestock. And there are actually many gods that were over livestock that you can consider. There was the god of Apries, which was a bull. And in fact, if bull passed away, that they would treat him like a pharaoh and they would give him a huge burial. There was the god of Hathor that was cow-headed, and the goddess of the desert. There was Khnum, who was the ram god. There was Bast, the cat goddess of love. These were kind of the things that were being hit between calves, between different livestock. These were the gods that were being targeted by God Yahweh. And he destroyed this. The Egyptians at this point were probably crying out to Pharaoh and to the Egyptian gods, saying whatever name they would cry out, saying, "Take care of our livestock." But God Yahweh said, "This is a punishment." God was stronger than all of those Egyptian gods that were over the livestock. Look at the sixth plague, which is the plague of boils. And for this one, I think there's two that we can probably most closely associate with this. There's the god Imhotep, which is the god over medicine and wisdom, and Sephresis, the deity in charge of healing. And these gods, once again, were facing off against Yahweh God and had no standing. God came through and put boils on the Egyptians, and he defeated Imhotep and Serapisi. We can read Exodus 9, 8 through 12. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Take handfuls of soot from the king, and let Moses throw them up in the air in the sight of Pharaoh. And it shall become fine dust over all the land of Egypt, and become boils breaking out in sores on man and beast throughout all the land of Egypt." So they took soot from the king and stood before Pharaoh, and Moses threw it in the air. And it became boils breaking out in sores on man and beast. And the magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils, for the boils came upon the magicians and upon all the Egyptians. But the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and he did not listen to them, as the Lord had spoken to Moses. These Egyptian magicians could not stand before Moses. That God is showing his power to Egypt and these Hebrews, saying, "I, Yahweh, am the one true God." And he defeated that God. The next one that we can see is the seventh plague, which is the god of hail. And the god that we would most closely associate with this one would probably be the god Nut. She was a sky goddess, and she controlled the skies over Egypt and brought protection and brought safety to the skies. In addition to Nut, there's also Su, the wind god, Horus, the sky god of Upper Egypt, and Seth, the god of crops. And all these gods failed to protect their people and the crops and the things that were happening against Yahweh as he rained down hail and pounded Egypt. God was stronger than those gods. He defeated those gods. And then we can go to the eighth plague, which is the plague of locusts. So after the hail came down and destroyed so many crops, so many things, the few things remaining, locusts came and was going to start eating it. And the god that was closely associated with locusts, we can look at the god it's called Nepri. It's the god of grain, or Emret, the goddess of childbirth and crops, or Isis or Thermuthis, the god of fertility and harvest. Seth, the god of crops. Once again, these guys were all being affected. They were trying to have these gods that they would pray for that would give them blessing, but God Yahweh said, "I am better." And he showed his power, and Pharaoh still hardened his heart. But God Yahweh said, "I am most powerful. My people will come out." We can go to the ninth plague, which is the plague of darkness. The Egyptians had many, many gods, but they had a sort of a hierarchy of gods. And Ra was the supreme god of Egypt. And Ra was the sun god. God was going for the top gods at this point, saying, "You believe that Ra is your top god, the god of the sun, the god that provides you with this wonderful sun to help your crops grow, to give you sight, to give you the ability to move around. Well, I will block the sun." And there was darkness. Ra was being attacked, not only attacked, but defeated by God Yahweh. So let's read this. This is Exodus chapter 10, verses 21 through 29. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand toward heaven, that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt, a darkness to be felt." So Moses stretched out his hand toward heaven, and there was pitch darkness in all the land of Egypt 3 days. They did not see one another, nor did anyone rise from his place for 3 days, but all the people of Israel had light where they lived. Then Pharaoh called Moses and said, "Go, serve the Lord. Your little ones may also go with you. Only let your flocks and your herds remain behind." But Moses said, "You must also let us have sacrifices and burnt offerings, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. Our livestock must go with us. Not a hoof shall be left behind, for we must take of them to serve the Lord our God. And we did not know with what we must serve the Lord until we arrived there. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let them go." Then Pharaoh said to him, "Get away from me. Take care never to see my face again, for on the day you see my face you shall die." Moses said, "As you say, I will not see your face again." So as Ra was being attacked, there was other gods that you can throw in there. There's um, Path, which is not Path, Tath, Ptah, the creator of the moon, sun, and earth. Tem, the god of sunset. Shu, the god of sunlight and air. And then Ra, of course, who was the god of sun. All these gods were silent before Yahweh as Yahweh came in and had his way with Egypt, saying, "I am the true God." So as we come to the 10th plague, we see that it is the final plague. So back then, we see that there was a hierarchy of gods, and Ra being basically kind of the father god, but there was one more god that must be dealt with, and that was the God who is Pharaoh. Pharaoh was God on earth. Pharaoh was considered the son of the sun god Ra. So Pharaoh was the last god that God would attack. Because when the death of the firstborn came, it meant that all the firstborn kids in Egypt, those that did not have the blood of the lamb over the doorpost that the spear would pass over, would be killed. And the firstborn of Pharaoh would be his firstborn son, who would become Pharaoh when the current Pharaoh died. That son of Pharaoh, was God. So when Yahweh God sent this spirit to attack their firstborn, he was going after the God of the Egyptians that was on earth, and he took him out. He defeated Pharaoh. This plague kills the heir to Egypt, an apparent God whom was the future connection to the gods. God showed his power over even Pharaoh, and all the gods who were supposed to protect Pharaoh and Egypt had failed. God had won. And this section is Exodus 11:1 through 15:21 is kind of the rest of what we see. That Pharaoh's son dies and he says to get out. And the Hebrews leave, and as the Hebrews leave, they have these pillars of cloud and a pillar of fire that lead them. And Pharaoh gets upset, and Pharaoh says, I am going to go. In 14, verses 1 through 14, I want to read that for us, because I think this speaks to what God was doing. Then the Lord said to Moses, tell the people of Israel to turn back and encamp in front of Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. In front of Baal-zephon you shall encamp facing it by the sea. For Pharaoh will say of the people of Israel, they are wandering in the land, the wilderness has shut them in. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. And they did so. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the mind of Pharaoh and his servants was changed toward the people, and they said, what is this that we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us? So he made ready his chariot, and took his army with him, and took 600 chosen chariots, and all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the people of Israel, while the people of Israel were going out defiantly. The Egyptians pursued them, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, and his horsemen and his army, and overtook them and camped at the sea by Pi-hahiroth in front of Baal-zephon. When Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. Then Moses said to the people, fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, for which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you only have to be silent. And as we keep reading, we read that these Hebrews walk along this seabed that is dry. They get to the other side safely. And as Pharaoh and his people walk through, these waters crash down upon them and kill these chariot drivers and Pharaoh. And God defeats Pharaoh, the living God of Egypt. And as this 10th plague comes, we can see that, in addition to Pharaoh, we see that Meskheret, the goddess over birth and children, Hathor, who attended the birth of children, Me, the god of procreation, Isis, the god of fertility, Seklet, the guardian of life, Rumnet, the cobra goddess, and the guardian of Pharaoh, all failed to protect Pharaoh and Egypt. They all watched as God Yahweh said, I am the Lord. These are my people. The gods of Egypt failed to protect Egypt from the God of Hebrew. Exodus 12:12 is a verse that we didn't read, but I want to read that because this is where I want to finish with. Exodus 12:12 reads, For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. God is telling us that He is God. So there are 4 points that I want you guys to get from this lesson, and they'll be on the screen so you guys can see them. But first is that God has control over nature. That I know right now, as we are afraid of this virus, as we are afraid of this thing that is coming through and affecting so many people and so many nations and our entire world, that God is still over nature. He is over creation. That we can see that in the Bible time and time again, and we can see that in our world. So as we are going through this, be in prayer to God. Be in prayer that God will let this pass, that it will go quickly, and that it will go without impacting too many lives. The second thing is that God has control over creatures, that He has control over all the birds and locusts of livestock, that God has power over these things, that God is all powerful. Third is that God has control over the universe, that God, we can see that by how He removes the sun in the ninth plague, that God has shown His power over everything, not just things on earth, but things above. That we serve a God that is all powerful. And the last thing is that God has control over us. That God gives us free will, but God still impacts us. He has a path for our lives. He has wills that He wants us to do, and sometimes we don't, and God will use our rejection to further His plan, just as He did with Pharaoh. Pharaoh said, I will not do this, and he hardened his heart, and God said, okay, I will use that for my power. So as He has control over us, remember that we have no need to fear of the world, of people, of viruses, of any of this stuff. Yes, be safe. Wash your hands, do the things that we are doing. As a church, we are taking a break from meetings so that these viruses don't continue to spread. God tells us to be wise, but none of this stuff has the ability to destroy our souls. That God is the only one that has that ability. That we have safety. That even if our bodies are destroyed, even if we lose our lives to whatever may come, to whatever is happening, we have a hope and a assurance that cannot be taken away from us, that when this life is over, whether that is today, whether it's a year, whether it's 50 years from now, whether it's whenever, that we know where we are going. That is home to heaven with God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit. We have safety that the world cannot touch. We have a place that we can call home that fear, that worry cannot take away from us. God has control over everything. And I think that right now that is something that we need to remember. So I want to end today and just in a little time of prayer. And then after the prayer, I want to give you guys a few challenges to do until the next time that we're able to meet. Hopefully we have a little bit more communication next time. Hopefully sometime soon it'll be in person once again. So let's go to God in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you so much that you are a God that honors your promises to the Hebrews way back then and especially to us now. Lord, I thank you for being a God that is overall, a God that showed your power and might to the Egyptians many years ago. Lord, remind us that the same God that brought the plagues to Egypt is the God that still rules now. That regardless of anything that is sweeping through, regardless of any issues that come up, that you are still in control and that you still give us assurances that we are yours and that nothing can separate us from that. Lord, I ask that you be with our leaders, God, with our elders, with principals, with different people as they try to figure out how to navigate this issue, as they try to figure out how to keep us safe, as they try to figure out how to keep our society going. Lord, I ask that you be with those that are impacted, those that have the disease, our nurses and doctors that are dealing with this. Be with the medicine, Lord, and help this disease to end. Lord, I ask that right now, that you just help our worries and our fears, God. Calm any panic that we have, Lord. Help us to have an appropriate response, to take care, to be wise in how we do things. But to not let fear and panic rule us, because we know we know who holds the future. We know who holds all things in his hands, and that is you, God. Thank you for loving us. It's because of Jesus that we're able to pray. Amen. So as we end to this little time that we had together, I want to give you guys a few challenges. That these next few days, one, read about the 10 plagues. Read read through it a few times. As there's a lot of additional time, I know that there's school to do and there's work that has to be done from home and trying to figure out how to take care of the kids. But open it up. Over the next 3 or 4 days, read 3 or 4 of the plagues each day. Second, watch The Prince of Egypt. As you're home, if you have little kids, if you're with family, whoever you're with, rent it from YouTube, rent it from wherever. If you own it, just put it in and watch it. Remember the power that God has over everything. Third, be in prayer. Be in prayer specifically for our elders and leaders. Be in prayer for doctors and those impacted. And be in prayer for just kind of everyone as we try to find a good balance between wisdom and fear.